Recently, I posted my first video, ranking the dungeons of The Legend of Zelda, Oracle of Seasons. This time we're going through its companion game, Oracle of Ages. These two games aren't the same game with slight variations like the Pokemon series might make you expect. Instead, they're essentially two complete campaigns that share an engine, a bunch of items, and many gameplay concepts. They even link together in ways I'll describe later. People often describe Seasons as being focused on the action and combat, and Ages as a more puzzle-focused game. While I don't fully agree with this distinction, it's an easy way to explain the difference to someone who hasn't played the games. Ages definitely does have a different design philosophy, and that carries over to the dungeons. If you haven't watched part 1 about Seasons, I'd recommend watching that one as well. I'll be mentioning those rankings from time to time, and at the end of this video, I'm going to show a full tier list with the dungeons in both games ranked together. With all that out of the way, let's get started. The first dungeon, the Spirit's Grave, is a better introduction than the Gnarled Root dungeon from Seasons, but still not anything too notable. I like that the space it covers is bigger than you'd expect for a first dungeon. Some of the rooms are really empty with almost nothing in them to do, which I actually like since they contribute to the dungeon aesthetic. The mini-boss and boss are comically easy, but at least it's kind of fun to absolutely demolish them in literal seconds. I like how if you walk left at the beginning, you're immediately teased with a chest you can't open, only to loop around the whole dungeon, get the dungeon item, and come back to find it's actually the big key in a really satisfying moment. There are a few block-pushing puzzles, if you can call them that. There are also a few new puzzle elements that they introduce here, like these multicolored blocks you roll into the right position. These will be used a good amount later in the game, and as expected, their implementation here is really simple. I like this dungeon, but it's just a linear trek through to the end without too much to do, which gets it a B. I like some things about the Wing dungeon, but I also definitely have some issues with it. The beginning is honestly really boring, seeing you go through an intro section that has nothing interesting to do. You also don't even come back to it, so it doesn't contribute much to the larger structure of the dungeon either. Some of the in-room puzzles are just annoying, like this block rolling one, whereas some are actually pretty fun, like these enemies that hide on the floor so you have to keep switching the color to expose them. That was pretty creative. The layout of the dungeon isn't all that interesting. It kind of turns into a puzzle gauntlet where you repeatedly get a key, then open the only door you can even get to. I don't automatically dislike simply structured dungeons like this on principle, but it needs to do something more with that structure for me to like it. I do really like that you see this minecart section early on without being able to use it, so the end of the dungeon where you finally ride it to the boss is pretty satisfying. The boss is really strange too, and I actually kinda hate it. You literally sit there waiting for it to spin while nothing happens at all. While I don't think this dungeon is bad necessarily, and it does have some high points, the low points detract enough to make it probably my least favorite in either of the Oracle games so far, which gets it a C tier. The Moonlight Grotto can be a little annoying to get around, but it makes up for it with plenty of stuff that I like. For one, the Seed Shooter is an awesome item, and getting the right angle for your shots is always satisfying. It's used everywhere in the rest of the game, and it's always a fun time. It's also used well here in the boss fight, which is maybe a bit too easy, but it's also a very cool idea, so I give it a pass. I really like how once you break the 4 crystals on the first floor, the roundabout drops down to the basement floor, creating a permanent change that both lets you progress in the basement while also making it much simpler to get around the first floor. I was going to say that I had an issue with how hard it is to notice some of the keys you need to get, but after looking back at the recording, I think that's just my fault. I like that the path forward finally makes you think, but in this dungeon there are some sections where you have to slowly kill a few enemies to progress, and it just wastes your time when you have to do that kind of thing more than once. Solid B tier, it's a good dungeon and I'm ready for something truly great. Luckily, the Skull dungeon is exactly what I was hoping for. This is a colossal improvement over the last 3 dungeons, and it feels really different from them too. This one is an adrenaline-fueled, fast-paced gauntlet that never slows down and takes you through some really fun set pieces along the way. The best part by far is the item, the Switch Hook. This is easily one of the coolest Zelda items ever, like just look at this thing. Essentially it lets you swap positions with specific blocks and items, while also acting as a long-range attack you can fall back on for annoying enemies, and even letting you swap with enemies you can't kill. It's like the hookshot from other 2D Zelda games except on steroids. I actually can't get over how perfect the Switch Hook is. In a lot of future dungeons I actually preferred to equip this over the sword, which is just not a thing I can say about any other item in Zelda. It predictably leads to some awesome puzzles, and even if some of the sections using it don't make you think particularly hard, they're still just really fun to go through. This section where you have to stop the lava flow, then make a mad dash by switching with a bunch of pots while you try to outrun the lava is perfect. But the dungeon isn't just its item, and the rest is pretty great as well. If you're going to make a very linear dungeon where you just travel along the path laid out for you, this is exactly how I'd like it to be done. The main path is fun to travel, with some decent platforming challenges, a few color and tile puzzles, and a pretty memorable minecart segment. It was actually a really inspired decision to put this dungeon smack in the middle of ages to give you a break from the head-scratching puzzles. Maybe it's a bit easy for a mid-game dungeon, but I really enjoyed this one in basically every way. You know what? I'm feeling generous today. The Skull Dungeon gets an A+ tier. The more I think about this dungeon, the more I love it, and it's actually pretty similar to the Ancient Ruins, which I also loved in a lot of ways. And keeping up the trend we've been seeing so far, the Crown Dungeon is also pretty great. After the linear puzzle gauntlet of the Skull Dungeon, this one is the most open dungeon so far, which is a great way to change up the pace once again. Once you enter the dungeon, you can basically explore the entire first floor right off the bat, and pick up the dungeon item and a bunch of small keys in whatever order you want. It's nice that we finally get a macro level puzzle where you have to think about every move you make, especially since it makes use of these crystal switches that raise and lower the blue and red blocks. The switch hook and seed shooter pair amazingly with the switches too, making you think about the best way to hit each switch based on your surroundings and positioning. The dungeon item, the Cane of Samaria, lets you create blocks to push switches or to jump on in 2D sections, and it's fine, but after this dungeon it's really only used in situations where what you have to do is extremely obvious. At least the boss here uses it well in a unique and surprisingly challenging fight. The boss splits into multiple pieces that rotate around the walls they're stuck to, so you have to combine all the pieces by creating a path with the cane so that 2 of the pieces will join together. This boss was so good that they completely copied the idea in the most recent game, Echoes of Wisdom. Going back, the path to get to the boss key is a short section full of single-room puzzles that are actually really cool, like this block-pushing puzzle where the same colored blocks all move together and you have to get them into position. This is another great showing from Ages, but maybe it doesn't stand out to me as much as the Skull Dungeon, so I'll give the Crown Dungeon an A. I honestly had such a hard time trying to rank the Mermaid's Cave. On the one hand, we finally get to see time travel incorporated into the dungeons, which is really cool. This is the main gimmick of Ages, and up until now, the Oracle games didn't even try to incorporate them into the dungeons. They actually don't even tell you that this is possible, except for giving you a hint by having both a past and present dungeon key, which forces you to realize what that means by yourself. You can bomb breakable walls and open passageways in the past, which actually has an effect on the present. This means you essentially have 2 dungeons to solve at the same time, which is an incredible feeling and unlike any other dungeon in either of the Oracle games. On the other hand though, moving around here just kind of sucks. Anytime you switch time periods, a bunch of puzzles get reset. There are also these candle enemies where you light them on fire and wait like 10 seconds for them to explode, which is interesting the first time but maybe not the 25th. It just gets old way too fast. To be fair, you only are actually required to time travel once, but there are a few tough puzzles here that might cause you to switch again if you don't know how to progress. There's also this puzzle where you have to light 4 lanterns in the right order. Unfortunately, I chose the wrong one first, and I thought that the water was extinguishing the lanterns, and I'd have to come back after lowering the water. I was wrong though, they just get put out if you light them in the wrong order. I think this puzzle would just make more sense if it was next to the water instead of right on top of it. The dungeon item, the Mermaid Tail, makes swimming in deep water sections possible, but it also makes the controls for swimming pretty horrendous. You have to tap the D-pad in a direction repeatedly instead of holding a direction. Gross. At least you do go a lot faster, but that just sucks. I think the reason it is this way is so you can still use your items even while underwater, but there were definitely better ways they could have implemented it. On the bright side, this leads to a cool boss where you have to fight in and out of the water as its head moves above and below the surface. So yeah, I like the ambition of the dungeon and some of the ideas are really good, but it's just not really all that fun to complete because of the issues I mentioned. I'll put it at the top of B tier, which is a shame because I really wanted to like this a lot more. It was a weird choice to have 2 water dungeons in a row, but you know what? Jabu Jabu's belly is too good for me to care. To get the obvious out of the way, yes, the underwater swimming still controls pretty badly, and because huge parts of the dungeon take place underwater, there's no avoiding it. I'm also not a big fan of the dungeon item just being a longer switch hook. It was lame when they did that in Ocarina of Time, and is just as lame here. Okay, negatives over, it's time to talk about why this dungeon is amazing. This is designed a lot like the water temple from Ocarina of Time, with 3 different water levels that you have to switch between to make different puzzles possible and open different sections of the dungeon. The catch is that switching the water level closes off some routes and makes some puzzles impossible, while opening up new sections you couldn't do before. What makes this even more interesting is that you can only change the water level from the top floor, and you have to unlock each level over time. To do this, first you have to find the dungeon item, and then once every level is unlocked, you have to scour the entire area looking for around 4 small keys that you can get in pretty much any order, leading to the boss key. Getting all of those keys and cashing them in at the end just feels incredibly rewarding, and a huge part of that is that this dungeon really doesn't hold your hand. After you unlock the ability to change the water level, you have to make a conscious choice to go back and switch it, and the only way you'll know to do so is by understanding the layout and how each of the puzzles work. And because the dungeon is relatively compact, with just 3 medium-sized floors that are pretty easy to get around, backtracking to change the water level isn't too much of a chore, and each of the puzzles is in plain sight, meaning you have all the tools available to figure them out. There's also a really cool room with this small island that floats on the water, moving to whatever level you set the water to. It's raised slightly above the ground level of whatever floor it's on, and you can switch hook to it to get from one raised section to another. You have to realize how this works yourself, so it's also really satisfying to figure out. But yeah, Jabu Jabu's Belly is awesome. I'd say maybe the in-room puzzles could be a bit more varied, but turning the entire dungeon into one contiguous puzzle does a lot to make up for that. Even if they aren't too varied, I appreciate that most of these puzzles use the switch hook in some way. They knew they had a perfect item and weren't going to let it go to waste. To be fair, they also had to do this because that's one of the few items that works both in and out of the water. I think this one will slot into A+ tier, and is my favorite dungeon in the game so far. The final dungeon, the Ancient Tomb, is a great way to finish the game, and leans even more into its puzzle focus than any of the others. It feels really climactic from the moment you enter the tomb, as you have to get through a couple off-putting single-room puzzles one by one as you make your descent into the rest of the dungeon. Once you're down there, they immediately hit you with the compass and map so you can see that the tomb is absolutely massive. I really like this setup since it gets you prepared right away for a long and difficult dungeon, and luckily the rest doesn't disappoint. The upper floor is a pretty big maze where you have to deal with 2 roundabouts, a bunch of hidden switch hook sections that are often just barely out of view, and plenty of different ways you can enter the lower floor. There's also a huge line of crystal switch blocks that block your way until you find out later that you can actually jump on top and walk through the entire top section of the floor. That was a really cool moment. Once you make it to the lower floor, which is actually even bigger, you're tasked with finding 4 slates, one at each corner of the dungeon, to open up the way to the final boss. You can do these in pretty much any order as long as you find the dungeon item, the Power Glove, and I like that Ages is using a more non-linear structure one more time for the final dungeon. I like all the sections on this lower floor, with 2 rooms where you have to navigate around these red chaser enemies, and an underwater section with currents pushing you everywhere. Don't think that once you get to the second floor you're done though, because you still have to use both floors at once to make your way around, and the roundabouts make this pretty challenging. I honestly have no complaints about the dungeon whatsoever, and the aesthetic and interesting structure are enough for me to put this in A+ tier. Is what I would say if the boss didn't exist. This might be one of the absolute worst bosses I've played in any game. Is it hard? No, I really don't think so. The problem is that it has 4 phases, each of which has only one very specific way to deal damage, and each of them feels janky and unreliable. In the first phase, you have to hit the arms back at the head when they launch at you, which is fine and easy to figure out. Next, you have to time throwing a bomb in between its arms when it tries to crush you. Run out of bombs? Well, why don't you spend about 2 minutes walking back and forth between 2 slowly respawning bushes that give you a bomb maybe 1 in 20 times. The third phase, you have to bounce a seed from the seed shooter behind its head to avoid the shields it makes. The hitbox here is tiny, and even though I tried this a few times myself, I still had to look it up because it just wouldn't do any damage. The last phase, you have to wait for it to punch you and pull on its arm with the Power Glove to launch it back at the boss. Not the arm that tried to hit you, but the one that stays still. See what I mean? Every phase of this boss is incredibly easy, but you have to waste so many minutes of your life just figuring out what you have to do in the first place. I get that the bosses in this game are designed more like puzzles than actual fights, but this is just ridiculous and not fun at all. What was I saying again? Oh yeah, the Ancient Tomb. Unfortunately, it's gonna get an A tier instead of an A+ tier. As much as I despise the boss though, it's not enough for me to call the dungeon itself bad or even just good. It really is great, and still the 3rd best dungeon in the game, even with the ending being an absolute travesty. So, that's all the dungeons of Oracle of Ages. Here's the combined tier list from both Oracle games. Overall, both of these games have some very strong dungeons, but I don't think any of them reach the absolute peak of Zelda. Other than the dungeons, like Seasons, Ages is kind of mixed. While the overall design of Seasons was nothing special and is mostly kind of forgettable, I actually think Ages has a much more interesting overworld to explore. Part of this has to do with Ages having any attempt at a story whatsoever. The story in Seasons can literally be boiled down to, "Oh Nox, oh no." Ages' story actually has some heft behind it, with actual characters and a semi-interesting plot that ties in with the way you explore the world. Essentially, a sorceress named Varen went back in time to take over the world and have them build a giant tower for her. Over the course of the game, you see this tower grow taller in both the past and the present, causing all kinds of mayhem. Tying in with the story is the main gameplay gimmick of time travel. You unlock different ways to swap between the two time periods as you progress, and the past and present are actually pretty different. There are a lot of puzzles reminiscent of A Link to the Past, where you have to swap between the two worlds to progress, and I really like this kind of overworld design. These kind of puzzles ramp up over time, with my favorite being in the Zora area. Some islands have drifted about 4 tiles to the west between the past and present, letting you time travel while on an island and end up in the sea. This is really cool, and I haven't seen any other game have a puzzle like it before. Even outside of the time travel, this overworld is, at least on paper, way better than Seasons. The Goron area has a lot of fun minigames you have to complete to unlock the Mermaid's Cave. I usually hate forced trading sequences in games, but I actually like this one for some reason. The area is also pretty fun to navigate, so it gets a pass from me. There's also the Crescent Island sequence where some reptile guys called the Tokay steal all your items, so you have to go around the island getting them back. This section is awesome, almost feeling like a mini dungeon of sorts, as you have to trade specific items back and forth to unlock different areas and eventually get everything back. There's actually a lot of other sequences like these that I love as well. But, and I'm sure you were expecting this if you watched my Seasons video, man, I hate some of the events that happen in this overworld. To unlock Jabu Jabu's belly, you have to save King Zora from dying in the past so he can give you a key in the present. You have to get him a magic potion. To do this, you either have to get some fairy powder, which, by the way, I still have no clue how to accomplish, or go to some random door by the first dungeon that you haven't been back to in the entire game, that just so happens to be a witch's shop, who just so happens to be selling a magic potion for 300 rupees. On your way to the Skull Dungeon, some guy shows up by a bridge, but there's some kind of invisible criteria to get him to show up that I would never be able to understand without looking up a guide. I just walked away and came back to that screen while searching the entire world, and he was suddenly there. This kind of thing is fine for optional content, but not as the one specific thing that progresses the game. There are a bunch of other instances like this polluted throughout the entire first half of the game especially, and I just hate it every time. I just wish the game would give you a bit more direction on the main path when there's so many possibilities available to you, and save this kind of thing for side quests. The 2 Oracle games also link up in some interesting ways. Once you beat one game, you can input a password to the other with your save data. A surprising number of characters from the first game you play will show up in the second and remember you, which is honestly really cool. You also get a new section of final bosses, which is so unbelievably brutal that I don't know how anyone could beat it without save states, way too much time to waste, or some of the best gear in the game. I looked up the process to get that gear and, yeah, no way I'm doing that. I honestly don't get why so many Zelda games have a ridiculous amount of side content that not only would you never find without a guide, but the rewards are terrible too. Stuff like this makes it really hard for me to choose a favorite between Seasons and Ages. The dungeons in Ages are on average much more interesting and challenging, but because they take more risks, they also have more issues. The dungeons also focus on different things, with Ages being slower paced and forcing you to think about what you're doing a lot more, and Seasons being based on faster paced exploration and navigation. Ages is probably the more difficult game as well, and I think the bosses are worse because of the approach of making you figure out what to do instead of the fast-paced action in Seasons. The overworld is similar, where when it's good, it's really good, and I'd probably call Ages overworld better overall because the good parts are much better, but there are just too many moments where it absolutely sucks. I think I probably prefer Ages by the tiniest fraction, with stuff like Crescent Island and the trip to Zora's domain being the deciding factor. I'd probably have to give a rating of 8.5 out of 10 or so to both games if I were to assign a number to them. But yeah, that's about it. I like both Oracle games, especially their dungeons, but I wouldn't call either of them a personal favorite out of the now 11 games I've played in the Zelda series, and that mostly boils down to their overworld design. Now that I'm doing this dungeon ranking series, I'm very interested in playing some more Zelda games, including replaying some of my personal favorites to see how they stack up. If you're interested in seeing more and got this far in the video, make sure to subscribe so you can see whatever I make next. Thanks for watching.